Hello and welcome to the new edition of ITC Entertain the World. When I say new, the new format where we talk about an individual episode. And this week we're going to be looking at Thriller and the opening episode, Lady Killer. Now, I know some of you might think, why are they talking about Thriller? Thriller isn't an ITC series, surely. Well, if you have the DVD box set, you know that at the end of the episode, you'll see an ITC ident, but also I have a 1974 trade catalogue in which Thriller is advertised for sale to various territories. So, although it's not a sort of traditional ITC series in the way that we usually focus on, for example, a filmed television series like Danger Man or The Saint, it does come into the ITC catalogue. And because we like to do things a little differently on this podcast, that's why we've decided to go ahead and talk about Thriller. With that in mind, I'm going to say that I was never really aware of Thriller as a series. I didn't watch it when it was on television. And I first came to it when ITC released some home videos in the early 90s, and they released 2 volumes. And I have to say, I was pretty unimpressed by those 2 videos. It didn't grab me at all. And having been used to seeing sort of exotic locations and series made on film, Thriller looked to me sort of quite alien to ITC in the way that it's shot on videotape. There's not much location. And it felt to me more like a play than an actual television series. So for me, I wasn't really taken by Thriller at first, although over the years I did buy the DVD box set that was released by Network, and I slowly started watching them. And I do think there are quite a few clunkers, as with any TV series, particularly when it goes all supernatural and we have goats' feet and people and things like that. But generally, from what I've seen, and to my sins, I haven't watched all of the DVDs yet. It's one of these things where I have so much to watch, I never get round to it. But I have watched the first 2 seasons or series. I think in terms of hit rate, it's probably 2 out of 3, maybe, or 3 out of 4, pretty good. But I still find it quite a difficult watch, in all honesty.
I'm of a generation that I just about remember Thriller. I probably shouldn't remember Thriller, but it was on in our house on Saturday nights. So the main thing I remember of Thriller as a youngster is the opening credits with the fisheye lens and the clunking, stomping music. And that scared the bejeebers out of me. And it's a sort of thing about my TV memories. A lot of the impactful stuff from when I was very much younger is stuff that frightened me. But looking at it again through the DVDs, I think there's more to it than you might suggest, Jazz. There's a bit more quality to it, even though it's a videotape production. But I think the biggest problem with Thriller is repetition. It's roughly the equivalent of a modern anthology series, and the themes, to me, are very basic. There's a very strict set of rules in terms of what they're doing. When you look at the actual transmission figures, it really went out in a very compact period of time from the early 70s to the mid 70s. So you wonder when people clocked on to repetition. I don't think we clocked onto it in our house. We just watched it. But looking back now, I find it a bit repetitive.
In terms of what you were saying, Jazz, it is closer to theatre than cinema, unlike a lot of those ITC shows. Now, I don't personally have a problem with that because a lot of my favourite 60s shows are videotape shows. I would back Callan as being every bit as good as Danger Man, and I'd back Public Eye as being every bit as good as Man in a Suitcase. What it does mean when you make something on videotape is obviously there's going to be a lot more time in rehearsal, less time filming, recording, and it is going to be mostly studio bound. But I think for a show like Thriller, studio bound suits it. I mean, I have read Brian Clemens's comment that they were allowed 7 minutes of filmed inserts. And actually, he'd have been quite happy had it been 0 minutes because he wanted that claustrophobic feel. But I do agree with Smudge. I think as you watch the 43, I think it is, stories, you do realise after a certain period of time that Brian Clemens' trope of normally a young, attractive female stuck in a motel, office block, apartment block, country mansion does come up again and again and again. And that's one of the dangers I think you get when virtually the whole series is written by one person, because even the few episodes he didn't write himself, he storyboarded and then passed them on to someone else to fill in the dialogue. I mean, Brian Clemens is one of the most fecund, creative, prolific TV writers out there. But my theory has always been that he's better when he doesn't have overall control. So you look at his episodes in Danger Man, Persuaders, Champions, Auto Kill, things like that. I think he writes some brilliant stories. But I think probably Thriller would have benefited from greater variety of writers.
Yeah, I think for me, like I say, I've not seen them all yet. And from what I have seen, it is already becoming quite repetitive. And I know that they say there's only sort of 7 real stories you can ever tell, and all the rest is just kind of a reworking of that. And I get that. But maybe it's the fact that they feel repetitive, not only because of, say, an isolated young woman, but also I think things like the sets and that the fact that there isn't that much filmed insert location footage. It feels like there's predominantly 2 or 3 sets per episode that they just stick in. And my criticism is that although I think Brian Clements can write a good plot, I find some of his dialogue, to be honest, pretty weak. These feel a little kind of like it's plot, 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 and like don't give too much away in what the actors are actually kind of portraying in, say, emotion. The dialogue seems very clipped.
It's ironic that you think that, Chaz, because obviously with this one, well, with a lot of them, because they are so restricted, because they are so claustrophobic, so much of it is dialogue driven. And yet the dialogue is fairly mundane. I have to grant you that. But it's the sort of show where you can turn away from the telly for a couple of minutes. You can just hear the soundtrack and you still know what's going on. I mean, there is an element of radio for television to it because it is so theatrical. The money, or some of the money at least, goes into decent set design. I do like the set designs. And contrary to what we might think, there is a little bit of creative freedom for the directors. When you look at how the sets are constructed, and how the shots are done in this episode in particular, the one we're going to look at, it's not too bad. It's quite clever, really. But there are some cliches and there are some clunky bits, as we will go on to discuss.
I think this is probably one of the reasons that a fan's favourite is Coffin for the Bride, the Helen Mirren double role. And in fact, it was Clemens's favourite episode, because we actually move away from formula. We go beyond it, where instead of a woman being the ultimate victim and being chased around and will she be saved at the last minute or not, we actually have a powerful female who turns the tables on Michael Jaston. And I think we could have done with a few more female power episodes like that, because that's an episode I've rewatched with my son the other week. And like me, he didn't even realize Helen Mirren was playing both parts. And it was such a different one-off play that I think they could have done with some more like that.
That was one that was on the videotapes, and it's about the only one that I thought was all right. I will agree with you on that one. Some background on Thriller. To be honest, I don't know that much about it because I'd never seen it. And of course, back in the day before the internet and things like that, and maybe even before videotapes, if you hadn't seen a program and it was listed in a book, you had no idea of what it was actually about or like. So I never really got into it. And I probably admit that I'm not hugely into it now.
It allegedly came up as part of the Julie Andrews deal. I think we've spoken on Tamarind Seed about how some journalists rubbished Julie in America and Lou invited them all over for a lunch and to show them how publicity and treating your star should be done. Allegedly, during the flight across from LA or wherever, this series, Thriller, was one of the bundle brokered on that flight. The first 5 episodes were pre-sold to, I think it was ABC, first transmitted in America before they ever reached our shores, because they'd been having some difficulty with their late night slots. And contrary to what you might think, they didn't leave the late night slots alone. They were as much ratings driven as ever. and a talk show, some of which was filmed in Elstree, the Dick Cavett show. He used to come over here to film his English guests. That was on a downward slope, and the network had a series of programs, world of, all banded together, and they sort of created this world of mystery and suspense, which they were going to use as a hopscotch formula, A, B, on different days throughout the week to fill that lower slot. That's how it's sort of fundamentals of how it got off the ground. Clemens stamped his watermark all over it as much as he could in terms of writing and script editing, etc. But the fact of the matter was that he couldn't be a producer because of this show being a stroke ITC ATV show. The producer had to be an ATV staffer. So you get a feeling that Brian lived with that, but he was still frustrated with that because he still had fingers in the pies as to casting and what have you. Program's got a decent budget. $100,000 per episode, pre-sold. So everything international sales Lou made was pure profit. But then you've got to offset that against the huge costs they incurred, bringing American stars over, giving them the full star treatment. People were staying at places like the Dorchester, the Savoy. So that's a hell of a chunk of money. As we see from the episode, the running time was extended to fit the States, which Clemens said he liked as it benefited the scripting. I'll argue against that later.
I think also we probably have to put Thriller in the context of the Brian Clemens chronology as well. Obviously, in 1969, The Avengers has come to an end. And then he makes a series of films, including And Soon the Darkness, which I personally think is Clemens's best thriller/horror film. And then something like See No Evil or Blind Terror. And you can see when you watch a film like that, you can see that it's going to filter through to thriller. So the idea not only of a woman stuck in this remote mansion with her dead family, but she's blind as well. And these are the sort of tropes which he'll use in the thriller series. Even an episode like The House That Jack Built, that's quite a dark Avengers episode. And you can see how Clemens picks up all of these things and then reworks them and recycles them in thriller. It's almost a sort of a natural run-on from, as I say, particularly those movies he's making at the beginning of the 70s.
Yeah, and in terms of when this was made, this was 1973. So you talked about Clemens's chronology. I should say about the ITC chronology there. So obviously 70, 71, we're getting Persuaders and Jason King. Then we're getting Protectors and The Adventurer, which are basically 25-minute as opposed to an hour and 16mm as opposed to 35mm. And so this kind of does feel a bit like we're downgrading from film and we're downgrading in duration of episode. So we can kind of downgrade from film to videotape. But that running time thing that you mentioned, for me, I feel personally, having watched the first two seasons, they're 10 minutes too long. I find them a bit draggy, to be honest. And I don't think it's helped by the fact that the dialogue, I don't think it's that great. Personally, I can see where Lou was thinking of where this might fit. And if he's pre-sold it to America, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? I'm not sure how well it did in other territories. I know it was sold into Australia and I think France and Canada.
In terms of production, it seemed to get quite a few benefits. Obviously, we had the draw of the big casting from ABC across the pond. We could have our pick of the stars to bring them over. But like I said, it was a terrific expense, probably half the budget of each episode. And then we could reciprocate so long as the UK star was a name in America and we could flip somebody over. So they had that. Another fringe benefit of Thriller was because of the link up with ABC, it was considered an international program. So it managed to go through a strike at ATV at the time. And they had some very good production time. They had a very generous production schedule. And amazingly for video, they had rehearse record in the studio over a number of days rather than just one studio day. So there was a lot to it. Taking those factors into account, I think you might have expected a little more quality. I would agree with you that quite a few bits are overlong. We'll see some evidence in this one. To me, it's a big push in revival of the anthology format, which possibly doesn't 100% come off.
I wouldn't disagree with any of those comments. there is a benefit from having some of those American stars, because some of the people who appear in Thriller, they're big, big names on American TV. George Maharis had just been in Route 66, which was enormous. You've got Burke, had been the main actor in Naked City in the original series. So those were decent names for American TV. I understand it went up against Kojak, which is a big ask. And so certainly the audience figures for the first season or first run are not enormous. I think they were about 5.8 million.
When you say it was up against Kojak, was that in the UK?
Yeah.
Right. That explains a lot then, because Kojak I can remember watching clear as day. You were talking about the Americans coming over. There's lots of people that you recognise in the episodes.
I'd have been far too young to watch Thriller first time around. It was buying the box set the first time, which was sort of my experience of watching it. I'd agree with what you said right at the beginning, Jazz, that probably 3 out of every 4 episodes are entertaining. And that's not a bad hit. I personally am less sure about the show when they do go down the supernatural route. And I know it's a fan's favourite, but the one with a title like Somebody at the Top of the Stairs, I just thought was awful. I just thought it was ridiculous. And actually, the ending was quite tasteless. I do prefer it when it's psychological realism and psychological thriller, because I think that's Clemens at his best. You've got a woman stuck late at night in an office block, and she doesn't know if the guy's in the lift coming up, or to me, those are the scenarios where thriller really, really works.
Yeah, they're definitely better. I mean, and this one, to be fair, I think this is quite a strong opening episode for this series. When I compare it to some of the others that are in that run, I mean, I think the one that starts off in the train station with the red rose, that could have probably been an opening episode. That's a pretty strong story. There are some that definitely don't feel like, you mentioned that one, Someone at the Top of the Stairs, or I think that's absolute garbage. And if we were doing a clunkers like in our normal review, that would be the number one clunker. Anyway, we digress.
We get it sort of early on here in the episode we're going to look at. There's a sort of set of rules, a template for Thriller from Brian. One of the things which strikes you in the modern age is that really the show is quite kind of misogynistic. He follows the Hitchcock drive, the thing about the brittle blondes being in peril. There's a very distinctive feeling to Thriller, and it becomes to the point of repetition. There's isolation, which is probably down to the lack of available film recording time. Claustrophobia, down to the sets. Everything seems to be set in the southeast. There's a lot of home counties danger, psychotic villains, women in peril. That's, for me, the basic psychological template for Thriller. When they dip into the supernatural, they go off-piste, and that's a different story. But the fundamental thing is there's always a victim, and the victim is usually female. As Rodney said, Coffin for a Bride, there is such a brilliant power switch, and we could have done with more episodes like that.
Yeah, I mean, Smudge has just mentioned Hitchcock, and obviously Brian Clemens was a huge Hitchcock disciple, and why not? And this is his ultimate homage to Hitchcock. The one problem being that Hitchcock, when I think of his films, I think of inventive direction. And if there's one thing Thriller really does not have as a series, it's inventive direction. There are lots of little homages played to Hitchcock, which, unless you're a massive Hitchcock fan, will go over your head. So there is the Cary Grant moment in, I think it's called Suspicion, when he's carrying the glass of milk up the stairs. And Hitchcock put a light inside the glass. So all you've got in this really noir image is this glowing milk, and you're not sure, is it poisonous? Is it not? Is he going to bump his wife off? Is he not? Now, that moment is used in at least 2 Thriller episodes where someone is carrying hot milk up the stairs. But there's no subtle lighting. And obviously it's not noirish anyway. It's in sort of videotape colour. And so really that homage, I think, is lost.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on the direction. I think the direction is so flat. I know that in the one we're going to talk about, there might be 1 or maybe 2 interesting angles, but generally it feels to me like, here's the set, we've just put the camera in front of it, and we're just going to film. And to me, I think that's part of the issue, that why it feels so sort of stilted in a way. But it's interesting you mentioned Hitchcock there as well, because obviously Brian's gone on record as being a huge Hitchcock fan. And whereas, I'm a huge Hitchcock fan and I love Hitchcock films and I watch them over and over again. And I don't see any sort of Hitchcock at all in Thriller. The occasional little bit, like you say. But I think if this is Clements's attempt to do Hitchcock, I think sadly he's kind of missed the mark. Sorry, Brian.
My take on the Hitchcock angle is that if he is such a big Hitchcock fan, he obviously watched a load of the old Hitchcock anthology series himself, because in this one there's a vague resemblance to an early Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Don't Come Back Alive. And he definitely does a Hitchcock, because there are at least a couple of MacGuffins in here, as we'll see in a minute.
There's an episode based at a motel, and one of the main characters is called Bates. I quite like things like that. There are clever little things that he slips in. And I do think there are Hitchcock-esque things in the narrative. It's just that obviously visually, we're not talking about something cinematic.
It's interesting there you both mentioned the anthology nature of this series, because when I compare it to, say, Hammer House of Horror, which came obviously a few years later and is an ITC anthology series, I think personally that Hammer House of Horror beats this series hands down.
Yeah, it's much more inventive. I do get a general feel that quite a bit of Thriller is sort of like an old half-hour anthology format, somewhat padded out. It's a strong enough opening episode, but I still think there are bits of padding here and there in this one.
You look at something like The Twilight Zone, and Brian Clements compared this to The Twilight Zone. He said that fisheye lens and the Laurie Johnson music at the beginning was very much inspired by The Twilight Zone. Well, The Twilight Zone worked brilliantly as half hours. And when it moved to an hour-long format, on the whole, it really didn't work. And I'm not suggesting that Thriller should be a half-hour format, but I think probably that sort of 48, 50 minutes would have been better.
Well, moving into the episode itself, Ladykiller, obviously written by Brian Clements. And the cast is Robert Powell playing Paul Tanner, Barbara Feldon playing Jenny Thrift. And if you look at her passport, it looks like a real passport with just the name Jenny Thrift almost like glued over the top. T.P. McKenna playing Jack Hardesty, Linda Thorson playing Tony. They're the main four. And that's one of the things I was going to say as well about Thriller, is that the casts are generally quite small when you have your 3 or 4 principals, and most of it goes around those 4 main actors. Understandably so, from how we've been talking about it. I think personally this is quite a good first episode. There is padding in it and it does feel long in places, and there's quite a lot, particularly at the start, of what I call telephone acting, where we have Robert Powell talking to no one. It's one of those things that was done at the time. But overall, pretty good start. Some nice little location filming at the start. I think that's Swanage, although it's never indicated where this story takes place. Probably 3 or 4 sets, the hotel set, the house set, and within each of these there are a number of rooms. There's the hotel lobby, and there's the room where they sit down and chat. And then in the house itself, there's like the front room and the sort of entrance lobby. And there's obviously an upstairs, there's a bedroom. Pace-wise, even though I said I think they're 10 minutes too long, this romance in this story moves at a remarkable pace. If I'd ever met a girl like that and I'd said, oh, let's go and see some Shelley books, and the next day I'm going to get married to you, and I am married, I'd be a bit worried. I suppose if we start at the beginning, I mean, it's a bit of a sort of cliche the way they meet and that, but I suppose you've got to set the story up in some way.
It's obviously not a whodunit, as we know straight away that Paul Tanner is in Rongan. He's out there searching her hotel room and he finds the passport. I actually say there's a lot of telephone acting, but this is Brian's drip feeding the plot. This is what he does throughout the story. He drips little bits of plot here, there, and everywhere. The whole thing is designed to maximize suspense, hopefully, as you say, with the pace at such a fast enough clip that the viewer won't notice lack of characterization, certain plot holes. What I find with the telephone acting is fine. It sets up the initial plot. But as you proceed through the episode, you get that plot repeated again by different characters in different places. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, enough already. We know what the plot is. You don't need to tell us again. And I think there is a slight drag of pace just before Jack Hardisty's character arrives. And I think there are odd moments of directional touches. And what you've got to remember is directional influence doesn't just extend to the camera, it's performance as well.
I'm going to take umbrage with one of those points. Why on earth, when you're staying in a sleepy hotel in Swanage as an American tourist, would you not leave your passport in your room? I mean, this poor woman is not John Drake. I do like the beginning because I like the idea that this is a very staid hotel in probably a very staid seaside place. She's bored, and Robert Powell's character is almost like a stalker detective. He notices she doesn't get any mail. She asks, any post for me? No one's writing to her. She's a loner, and he hones in on that. And I think he does that very well. And I do like the telephone bits in the sense that we don't know who's on the other end of the line. He's giving out instructions. I need a book of Shelley poetry, etc. But we don't find out. And of course, the Linda Thorson character has a genderless name anyway. Tony could be a man or a woman, couldn't it?
Yeah, that sleepy, like you say, hotel in a seen better times seaside resort is quite Clements-esque in, like you say, in isolation and all of that. You might as well have all those downbeat kind of things within there. But it does quickly move out of that into this place that she thinks they own, and then it's later revealed that it's rented. It's quite a decent set, to be honest. I think you were right there, Smush. They did put some money into the sets, and the dressing of the sets is quite nice. But there's some bloody odd things going on here. They just got married. They don't go on a honeymoon. They go to this new place. And the first thing I noticed about it is like they're sleeping in separate beds. If I'd just married this girl and that, I'd be wanting to sort of bolt the marriage out, if you know what I mean. I find all that incredibly bizarre. There's some sort of funny little things in the plot like that I just think, like, that's just naff. Make it that they're in bed together. If he's going to marry her and convince her that he's the one and all of that, and okay, maybe they couldn't be seen in bed together because of some TV rules or whatever. Some of it feels just a bit clunky.
Yeah, well, there'd be a suitable explanation for that because Paul's character is written very smoothly and Powell plays it to near perfection. It's a classic example of the con and gaslighting. So whatever sort of fault you would find with them not sleeping together, he would no doubt explain that because he's really, really sharp and smooth in that respect. He plays on things like her keenness when he leaves her hanging around for dinner. It's sort of fish on the hook, reel her in. He pretty much lays it on with a trowel, but he is quite convincing for the most part. But there are elements with him where you think he goes psychotic, like changing the hair, changing the dress, and he sounds like a psycho. And I'm sitting there thinking, why aren't you running now?
Can I just come back there and say, more to the point, he doesn't even kiss her until he finds out later in the episode that she's a millionairess. Every time he goes to embrace her, he kind of ducks out the way as if to say, like, well, I'm not kissing you, love.
The single beds thing, I mean, obviously, the fact that there are two single beds rather than a double bed is explained by the fact that it's a rental property. It's not their furniture. But as a newly married couple, you would put those two single beds together and put the bedside lights to the side, and you'd be getting on with the business. I'm sorry, because he's got to fulfill his undercover role. I do think, though, in terms of, if we're talking about the sort of sexual dynamics of the episode, one thing they do very, very well is the fact that his new wife seems quite, not cold, but she's not particularly sexy. I'm not talking about the actress, I'm talking about the character. The Linda Thorson character comes over as extremely sexy. We often see her in the darkness, like when they're having their little covert meetings in that chapel. And you can understand why he's saving himself for wife number one.
Well, it's all in her eyes as well with Linda Thorson. When she's looking at him, she's giving him the come on, isn't she? But she's got that look as if to say, like, I'm bloody hot. Yeah,
And don't you dare go near your new wife.
Yeah. And I just found it a bit bizarre that if he's supposed to be marrying her, that surely in terms of romance, because it is this whirlwind romance, it should seem to be a bit more kind of warm on both parties. Even if he's doing the dirty on Tony, he should be trying to embrace this woman. Her character is very cold and kind of like little girl at times. And she's so forgiving of him, he's late for this and he does this and he does that. And he has a go at her for having her hair up, and she's crying and he comes up, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, I'm all right again now then. That's fine. That's why I think that Clements isn't great at dialogue.
The trouble is the focus is on the con. It's all Paul. She has to be extremely naive, extremely gullible. She's romantic in her own way, but she believes in the Shelley poetic romance. But essentially, as a character, she's way underwritten. There's no depth to her. We can't know too much about her because there's stock in the big reveal towards the end. So we can't know a lot about her. And she has to be extremely naive to fall for things the way they are set up. So she is, as in terms of character, she's quite two-dimensional, but Clements was willing to accept that in lieu for the fact that he keeps the suspense going. Bang, bang, bang. It's supposed to keep you on the edge of your seat.
On the DVD box set, Brian Clements says that he wanted Robert Powell on the back of Jesus of Nazareth. He obviously misremembered that because Jesus of Nazareth comes after Thriller. But Robert Powell is very good at playing these cold, clinical, handsome, but actually in a rather creepy way characters. Because within a year of playing this, in one of my dad's Zodiacs, he plays almost the identical part. That's based in Brighton. And again, he's killing a young woman and he's on the make. And I do think he's very good in this. And when you do bear in mind he goes on to play Jesus, there is a wonderful irony that he can do both.
To be fair, my criticisms of the actors, actresses are not necessarily aimed at them as actors. It's more that the fact that they can only deliver the lines and do what the directors give them the direction for. And it feels like there's not much direction going on here at all. I'm not being hard on them, kind of being more hard on the actual kind of mechanics of this. And I do think Powell is good in this. To be honest, even though Barbara Fountain's character is basically nothing, she can clearly act. She's good enough. The person who really steals it is T.P. McKenna. I mean, he never, ever is poor in anything he does, but he's got this real menace about him. And he clearly knows that Paul's up to something. And he gives the game away where he says, oh, I thought it was Tony to Jenny. Oh, he hasn't told you about that. I just love that he's devious and he's absolutely fantastic.
I mean, talking in terms of direction and actors, Powell is very good because you can see him thinking when she mentions that she's met Jack Hardesty, you can see there's something going on behind his eyes in the reaction to that name. In terms of direction, that push shot that Bill Hayes does when Powell's got his back to us, he's getting tensed up about Mrs. Bradley being hired as the cleaner. And you can feel that as the camera pushes in and moves, and then Powell does one of those switches and everything is sweetness and light. One of the best pieces of direction is that little hold that he does in the two shot when Hardesty and Paul first come face to face. He just holds them in a two shot for a little bit longer. And the tension between them, because of that, is absolutely electric. And to give him his due, with the limited sets and the way the sets are constructed to be so interlinking, which is quite a challenge to any camera in such a small environment, the way Brian Holgate has designed where you can lift the fourth wall, the few positions he can get his camera into, he does pretty well with some good angles when people are walking around or moving through the sets. There are some nice little directorial touches to give him the benefit of the doubt.
I mean, T.P. McKenna, and as we record this on the Sunday, it was his birthday, would have been yesterday. And I put a piece out on social media about him. When you get someone of T.P. McKenna's quality, it just gives everything a huge lift. And here, obviously, he's only in a couple of scenes, but it just takes the whole episode to a new level. Wonderfully enigmatic character. He's obviously been working with Paul Tanner in the past on some sort of blackmailing schemes or whatever. He just brings a depth, doesn't he?
He's effortless. That's the thing I really like about him. He makes it look so easy. And obviously that's through years of experience. He's not in a particularly large amount of the story, but he lifts it. He's a real key part of lifting this episode for me. And Smudge, when you talk about that moving around sets, I would only say that moving around is good when it's in the chapel or the little churchy bit where Tony and Paul meet. And there is some nice little bits there. But generally, the camera doesn't move around so much, especially in the property that they're renting. And if it does, it tends to move around with the cleaner character. I still think a lot of this is, in terms of directions, very flat. But anyway, T.P. McKenna, top marks.
What I'm thinking of in terms of how he shoots through the set and uses the interlinked rooms so that the characters can move between them. But coming back to T.P. McKenna and what you've just said, Jazz, where they have the confrontation, it's basically the two stags, isn't it, really? And to me, this is the thrill of the thriller of this episode. This incident, this whole thing based around Hardesty and him being seen off. You look at the power in that limited scene. I mean, when they're playing with the canter stopper and TP is juggling the stopper. And then as it goes up, Paul does a McGill-like move when McGill was playing with his cigarette on the edge of the table. He snatches the stopper out of midair and makes eye contact. And that is really sort of threat. And like I say, I think the real thrill, because I think the ending is muffed.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, I think McKenna is underused. And I really don't have any idea why we bother with the Mrs. Bradley cleaner. I know there is a little moment with the stopper, but she brings nothing really, which is such a waste of a very talented actress as well. But I think we could have done without her and with somehow using more of T.P. McKenna.
No, I'd agree with you there. I think that she's like a padding. This is like where it feels like the episode is 10 minutes too long. I suppose TP is in that additional scene where she unwraps the package and it's the tape recorder and it's got his voice coming out and he's explaining the whole scenario to her. His presence is there. And again, like even just in his voice, though, the delivery of that is so great. Like you say, Rodney, I wish there was more of him and completely writing out the cleaner lady, who I just feel is kind of superficial to the plot.
It's Clements doing Hitchcock again. He's trying to add an ambiguous character. We don't know where she lies, where she sits. I love the fact that while she's having a tipple, she leaves the cleaner running to pretend that she's working. I agree with Rodney. Mary Wimbush, I believe she was a last-minute replacement, but she is totally and utterly wasted.
Do we ever really find out why Jenny is in the UK? I mean, I know she loves her romantic poets, but in fact, it's only when Paul suggests that they go and visit Shelley's house that they actually go there. What is she doing, this millionairess, in Swanage?
It's a very good question. And one that I sort of thought to myself exactly at the start. It's like, surely if she's coming over from the States and she's very well off, I thought that she would be in the West End of London or at the Savoy, or maybe she was up in some
Edinburgh,
lovely part of Scotland or something like that. Why would you choose Swanage? I'm from Dorset. I know Swanage very well, and I know what Swanage was like in the 70s. Drab and run down.
Basil Fawlty is from Swanage, sums it up.
That's a really good point. I suppose that's artistic license in Clements in his writing in that. But yeah, we never find out why she's here. And it does seem really peculiar that we don't know why. And what does she do? She just falls in love immediately at the first chap that sort of shows her any interest.
It's a point of convenience. It's a bit of idle writing. There are other examples of this, with Paul carrying his do-it-yourself blackmail kit or whatever it is in his briefcase, complete with a shot of his supposedly ex-wife, and he leaves it sort of standing round to be searched. It's just that little bit of clunkiness, isn't it? And you two really ought to be taken to task for expecting character and developed. I mean, the whole thing is designed for bang, bang, bang. At the end of it, you're either supposed to be sitting there in shock or sighing with relief, one or the other. Brian's taking you on a journey. You shouldn't be asking these questions.
This is a series, and Lady Killer is a perfect example, where it is all about atmosphere, menace, claustrophobia. Will he, won't he? Will she get away? We don't have psychologically real depth in terms of characters. We don't have much witty dialogue. Obviously, this is not going to be an episode where you're going to have witty dialogue anyway. It is really all about dark menace.
Do you think that he achieves that? Not necessarily throughout the series, but particularly in this. Because one thing that's difficult about videotape drama for me is that the kind of way, and I know you have to do this technically with the lighting, it just feels so bright all the time. Now, when you go to the exterior shots, it feels like it's in the autumn, but inside it feels like blazing hot summer just because of the studio lights. You mentioned that one shot where the cleaner was hidden in the dark little alcove and comes out. And that's about the only time I can think in the whole episode where there was an attempt to do anything slightly atmospheric in terms of lighting. And I know that in the mini chapel it's all dark and that, but that's how it is. That's fine. But within the house itself, it just feels like the menace is not there.
It's all about the suspense in this one. I mean, and this is why you lads are wrong about reconfiguring the bedroom, because we've got to have that rotary dial telephone at the side of the bed so she can hear it click, click, click. That's an element to add to the mystery. He sort of layers it. He drips it. Does she suspect? Does he suspect that she suspects? And it's that sort of tennis game he's playing with us, really. He's more going for suspense, particularly given the ending. I can't say I'm convinced by the menace angle.
When you do think about the twist towards the end, it makes you realise that actually Robert Powell's character has no redeeming features at all. Because if he'd been driven by wanting to do everything he can for his wife, who he loves so much, at least it would be a redeeming feature. But the minute he finds out his new wife is a millionaire, he's sort of not quite sure what he's going to do. He has no redeeming features. Now, I know some people might say, well, villains don't have to, but there isn't any nuance to him in the end, is there?
No, there isn't. And like, when she tells him she's got $1 million in the bank, you can see that shift in his character that he's thinking, right, actually, I'm bumping the wrong one off here. I should be bumping off Tony, surely. Like you say, there's nothing redeeming in that, is there? When it does get quite meaty, like you were saying, is when Linda Thorson comes back and he's shaving and he's saying, oh, darling, is that you? Thinking it's his new wife. And of course, Tony walks in and she's kind of furious that he hasn't done the deed yet in terms of bumping her off. And that's when it does start getting quite nice. That's when Linda looks really knocked off and she does give a really good performance there.
She goes into full Lady Macbeth mode. I mean, we've seen instance of it across the episode. Paul is basically just a psycho. He's greedy, he's venal, and there's a whole subtext to the episode. There's no honor amongst thieves. He's prepared to kill / betray Jack. He's prepared to betray his true wife. This man will do anything for money, and it's extremely cold. Literally, Clemens takes us to the brink when we think Paul is going to push Jenny off the cliff. And the MacGuffins of the two sets of clothes, the dress and the camel coat, are totally useless because she's dressed in black. Nobody's going to recognize anything from all this intricate witness setup that we've had before. And the final delivery, the final death, is so badly cut together. It's really scruffy, messy, ambiguous to the point where it leaves you uncaring.
The choreographing of any fight or action scenes in the whole series is really poor. So in the second Robert Powell episode, at the end, he's meant to have been thrown into this coffin by his adversary. And his adversary isn't within 5 feet. He just flings himself off this stage. I'm surprised, given the amount of rehearsal time, that they didn't get those sort of scenes. Because they don't need to be spectacular fight scenes, but just get those bits better done. My issue by the end is, are we emotionally invested in Jenny or not? Because I obviously don't want to see her bumped off, but there isn't much warmth. It's not someone who by the end I'm thinking, oh, for Jesus' sake, someone's got to save this wonderful woman. She almost seems passionless.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, of course, we don't want to see her bumped off, and we know that she's the intended victim, and it's all going to pan out that hopefully Paul will get away with this with Tony, but you don't really kind of feel anything for her, do you?
It's hard to engage with characters when you know so little about them. So much as in a humane way, you don't want Jenny to die, whether you actually care that much about her is a moot point. I mean, we know nothing about her. She's really a bit of a cipher. We don't even understand the circumstances, as you've said, about why she's here. And we never hear anything apart from, oh, I've got $1 million. We don't hear anything else. The bulk of the episode is taken up by Paul. We know Paul in terms of he seems to be a serial con man. We know he works with his wife. We know he's worked with Hardesty in the past, but that's about it. And it's difficult to feel for his wife going off the edge of the cliffs. That fight scene at the end is really badly done. As Rodney said, the physical aspects of this show seem to be vastly under-rehearsed, which is shocking considering how much time they have had. And it's so badly cut together. You see a flashing glimpse of Tony's face and possibly shoulder whizzing past the camera to her doom. But there's no impact. So if there's no impact in the death, there's no impact on the viewer. Whilst we accept the ending for what it is, and then there is a little bit of pleasure in seeing Paul hoist on his own petard, we walk away from this one in a relative state of indifference.
Overall, with Thriller, and Lady Killer is a perfect example, I have no problem with the show being made on videotape. I have no problem with it mostly being studio bound. But when you go down that route, the characters, including a bit of character backstory and the dialogue-driven nature, has to be spot on. And the one time we get that in this episode is when T.P. McKenna is in front of the camera. And suddenly you think, wow, it's theatrical rather than cinematic, but it's drama.
You said a good word there, drama. It's kind of drama-less. When I watched it first time, did it make me want to watch more of Thriller? It did a bit, but it wasn't like I was engrossed by this and thought, wow, that's brilliant. I must see more. I thought, oh yeah. And I kind of predicted the ending and I thought, yeah, okay. I'm not going to be too harsh on it. I'll give some more of them a go, and I'm glad I did. Yeah, overall, I think it's an all right start. Could be improved, definitely, with dialogue and character, as we've all agreed. I need to go back to this thing where you said about this fisheye lens and stomping theme. I'm not criticizing you when I say this. I don't think that theme is stomping at all. It's kind of like ding. It's like almost like a one-note sting on a piano. And something I noticed particularly in this episode, now I don't know if it's because Linda Thorsen's in it, but the music in this feels very Linda Thorsen-esque Avengers, which I didn't really notice in other episodes. And it's quite laid on at the start. I didn't find that image or that music scary at all.
I was just on the verge of being 10 and I shouldn't probably have been watching it at all. I get your point about the music because I worry initially that it was going to be a little bit overscored, but it mellowed as the thing went on. But I think if we're going to wrap up on the series, we've got to give it a bit of a quality judgment. There are elements lacking here that make it not the sort of series like the film series we've been looking at. It really doesn't stand too much close scrutiny because you have got these lacking elements. You've got the fact that there's little stroke, no variety in the writing. You've got this fact that we are restricted by the technology of videotape and studio. You've got the fact that we're in the writing, we are running a race. We are literally trying to keep the viewer on the edge of the seat. Because of that, everything else suffers. It doesn't really stand those scrutiny, and it rapidly becomes a victim of its own success because we have these template elements which soon become elements of repetitiveness. In terms of what we've done with ITC so far, this is more just a piece of entertainment television.
I'm always a fan of anthology series in general because they're very difficult to get commissioned because you can't sell an anthology series on a lead actor. You can't sell it on a location like a Portmeirion. It's very difficult to get the go-ahead. If you've got the same person writing most of the scripts or co-writing them, there is going to be a sameness. And it would be the same if Shakespeare was writing them. The only way you're going to get variety in scripts is having a variety of writers. That's the bottom line.
We didn't touch on that thing where they did it in America, where they made these elongated titles and stuff. They're all on their DVD set as extras. Looking at those, I think they look ghastly. I think they look really poor. The fisheye titles I like. I don't think they're scary, but I like them. I'm not so impressed with the music. But it works for what it is. It's short and sweet and it does the job. Here's Thriller, here's the character actors, away we go. But overall, as a series, I think it'd be really harsh for me to say if it's brilliant or if it's poor, because like I say, I'm only halfway through the DVD set and I've had that DVD set since Network brought it out. So you can tell how often I get it out and I have to be in the right mood for it. Generally, it's okay. There are some good stories. There's also some real clunkers. But this one overall for me, if I had to mark it out of 10, I'd give it a 7. It's an all right start and it shows some promise. That's for me where I sit with Thriller.
The quality for me now, coming back to it after all these years, is really the players. When you get a good guest actor and a reasonable plot, you can get a decent episode. It's not to be written off completely. It was never really designed to stand up to forensics in terms of the technology. It's a happy medium. None of the series we appreciate is perfect. In the main, it has some points of interest.
I think ultimately, this is a show where when you do have a really good main actor, it lifts it. So, I mean, Dinsdale Landon, who I think is the only person who comes back as the same character twice, I really enjoyed his performances, and they did think about a spin-off series. What I would say in defense of Thriller, though, when I talk about the importance of the actors, I wouldn't watch Department S ever again if Peter Wyngarde wasn't in it. Anthony Quayle is really what makes Strange Report. So this is the problem of an anthology series. You can't rely on a Wyngarde or a Quayle. And so when those T.P. McKennas come up, Helen Mirrens come up, you do realise that it can lift to, I mean, I agree with your rating. I was going to say 3.5 out of 5 for this episode and for the series, which makes 7 out of 10. I think that's about right.
I hope you don't feel we've been too negative or too critical with our overview here. When we were doing the evaluation of a whole series, we always had our clunker spots. I think we have to be honest in what we're looking at. We're not looking at masterpieces, no matter what some people might say, and it's their favourite show and they grew up with it and they can't see any fault in any of it. I'm the first to say that even as my favourite show, The Persuaders, not all episodes were superb. I'd just like to thank you for bearing with us on this, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I have been enjoying chatting about it, because I've never really chatted about Thriller in depth to anyone else. So I have enjoyed this experience. On that note, we'll say goodbye, and we'll be back again for another episode of ITC Entertain the World. I don't know what episode of what series we're going to talk about yet. We haven't decided that. That'll be something that we will no doubt have a discussion about very shortly. But in the meantime, I wish you all the best, and it's goodbye from me.
And it's farewell from me. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers for now.
Bye from sleepy Suffolk.
Don't have nightmares. You have been listening to the ITC Entertain the World podcast with Jazz Wiseman, Rodney Marshall and Al Smudge. It was a Bitter and Twisted production for The Morning After.